Okay, let's check out some fun and unique Great Circle routes around the world. So, you may have noticed that the cities of the so called Boss Wash megalopolis along the east coast of the US form a fairly straight line, and this is true. If you draw a Great Circle route from Boston to Washington, D.C., it'll pass pretty much directly over New Haven, Connecticut, New York City, Philadelphia, and Baltimore along the way. But it doesn't stop in Washington. It goes directly over Roanoke, Virginia, and Asheville, North Carolina, and eventually ends up in New Orleans. How about this? A Great Circle route between Madrid, Spain, and Singapore passes directly over Rome, Istanbul, Tehran, and Kuala Lumpur. The Great Circle route between Miami, Florida, and Cadiz, Spain passes directly over Bermuda and the Azores en route. A Great Circle route between Singapore and Las Vegas passes directly over Tokyo, and that's pretty much the only land it touches before meeting the west coast of North America. It's possible to draw a Great Circle route heading east from Alicante, Spain, across the Mediterranean, just barely skirting the coast of Tunisia, passing between Pantelleria and Sicily, bypassing Crete on the south, and finally ending where the Egypt Gaza border meets the Mediterranean coast, a total distance of 2,013 miles. That's about as long of a line as it's possible to draw in the Mediterranean without touching any land. Speaking of the Mediterranean, here's a fun one. You can start near the toe of mainland Italy, thread the needle between the Aeolian Islands and Sicily, pass through the Strait of Gibraltar, just barely miss Porto Santo and Madeira, and keep going for over 5,000 miles until you run into the Venezuelan coast without ever touching land. Okay, so you might actually be familiar with this one if you look at this sort of thing, because I believe it's the longest possible Great Circle route in the world that doesn't meet any land. But if you start at Karachi, Pakistan, and head south southeast across the Arabian Sea through the Mozambique Channel between Africa and Madagascar, round the Cape of Good Hope, just barely skirt the South Orkney Islands, pass by Cape Horn, bypass Easter Island on the west, and just keep going. Eventually, you'll run into the east coast of Russia's Kamchatka Peninsula, almost 20,000 miles from where you started. This one is in a similar vein as the last one, not nearly as well known, although still very, very long. If you start at Tybee Island, Georgia, near Savannah, and head southeast across the Atlantic, you'll round the Cape of Good Hope at South Africa, head across the Indian Ocean, just barely miss the northwestern coast of Australia, and eventually run into this island called Trangan Island off the coast of New Guinea, a total distance of over 15,000 miles without touching any land. So you might have looked at the Atlantic Ocean between Brazil and West Africa and thought, those coastlines don't look that far apart. I wonder what the closest they get is. Well, between this point on the Brazilian coast just north of Natal and this point on the West African coast called Cap Skirring, which is where the border between Senegal and Guinea-Bissau meets the Atlantic Ocean, the distance is just 1,767 miles, which isn't far at all in terms of transoceanic distances. How far is 1,767 miles, you might be wondering? It's just about exactly the same distance as between Albuquerque, New Mexico, and Trenton, New Jersey. Okay, so this one is partially based on geology, but it's crazy. So, in the Gulf of Guinea, where the African coast changes direction from east to south, there's something called the Cameroon Line, which is a chain of volcanoes stretching from Mount Cameroon on the mainland coast through the island of Bioko, which belongs to Equatorial Guinea, and the two islands of Sao Tome and Principe, as well as a couple of islands further south. But if you follow that same line northeast into mainland Africa, you run slap bang into N'Djamena, the capital of Chad. And if you follow that same line southwest, farther out into the ocean, you eventually run directly into the island of St. Helena, where Napoleon was exiled after Waterloo. And if you keep going way past that, you eventually run straight into the Falkland Islands off of southernmost South America. How's that for a coincidence?